Have you ever stood in your garden, looked down at a struggling plant with yellowing leaves, and felt that sudden sinking feeling of helplessness? That quiet voice inside whispering, "Maybe I just don't have a green thumb." We've all been there. And what usually happens next? We grab our keys, drive to the nearest big box garden center, and wander through towering aisles filled with colorful plastic bottles. Biostimulant complexes, microbial inoculants, premium root boosters, and chemical fertilizers covered in scientific-sounding names. Every label seems to promise a miracle. Every bottle promises a greener, healthier, more productive garden. But then you look at the prices: $30, $40, sometimes even $50 for a single bottle, and a much deeper question begins to form. How did we become so disconnected from the earth that we now have to buy its life back in a bottle? Welcome back to Earthly Delights, my friends. I'm incredibly happy to have you here with me today, beneath the shade of my garden canopy. Because today, we're going to break a spell. I'm going to show you how to build what is essentially a biological miracle machine right in your backyard. It takes only about 5 minutes of hands-on setup, costs less than the price of a single potato, and its microbial population can multiply dramatically within just 48 hours. This isn't simply another fertilizer. It is a bubbling, living tonic filled with billions of indigenous microorganisms capable of producing the same kinds of growth-promoting hormones that chemical companies work to synthesize inside multi-million-dollar laboratories. By the end of this video, you'll have the exact step-by-step method for making this plant food again and again. But more importantly, you'll understand the fascinating biology behind why it works. And beneath all of that is something even bigger. We're going to reclaim a little of what has quietly been taken away from us, our biological independence. So roll up your sleeves, open your mind, and come with me into the soil. Nature has never charged us a penny to make a seed sprout. It's time we remembered how she does it. Section 1. The $211 invoice and the cabinet under the bread box. This journey didn't begin in a laboratory or on some enormous farm. It began on a freezing morning in early February, right here at my kitchen table. I was sitting in this exact spot, running my finger down a column printed on a thin gray invoice from a major seed company. I went through the page once, then a second time, because I simply couldn't believe the number sitting at the bottom. $211. $211 for tiny paper packets of seeds and specialized organic plant food. And the irony was impossible to ignore. Many of the varieties I was preparing to buy had grown beautifully in my own garden the summer before. Yet when autumn arrived, I had casually tossed their remains onto the compost pile because I didn't know any better. But the money wasn't actually the part that bothered me most. Halfway down the page was a small line printed in italics. It said that one particular thin-skinned paste tomato, the variety I had grown and loved for 11 years, had been discontinued. Not temporarily sold out, discontinued. This was the tomato around which I had organized my family's canning season year after year. It had performed beautifully in my soil. It had never let me down. And suddenly, someone sitting in a corporate office thousands of miles away, someone who had never tasted that tomato, never touched my soil, and knew nothing about my garden, had effectively erased it from my future. Sitting there in that quiet kitchen, a memory suddenly came rushing back to me. I remembered my grandmother. I could see her small, weathered hands opening the wooden drawer beneath the bread box in her kitchen. At the very back of that drawer was a plain paper envelope. One corner had been folded over twice to keep it closed. Across the front, written in faded pencil, was the name of an heirloom bean. Below it was the harvest year. My grandmother never bought a tomato seed in her life. She never bought a bag of fertilizer either. She didn't need to. For her, saving seed and caring for the soil weren't hobbies. They weren't trends. They were part of a sacred, unbroken chain of survival. That winter, something finally clicked for me. I began to understand just how much we had been throwing away. We have been trained to think of ourselves as consumers inside our own gardens. We're told to buy the seed, buy the soil, buy the fertilizer, and then buy another product whenever something goes wrong. But the truth is that every one of you watching this already has access to an extraordinary biological powerhouse. It is sitting quietly in your garden beds right now, preparing next year's abundance while we walk past it carrying a hose. Every lettuce plant that bolts, every bronze dill head, every forgotten bean pod hanging at the back of the row. Those things are not failures. They are inventory. They are nature trying to place the keys to independence directly into your hands. And today, we're going to take those keys back. Section 2. The Secrets of the Undisturbed Forest. To understand how we can grow what feels like unlimited plant food inside a simple bucket, we first need to take a walk. We need to step away from manicured lawns, fertilizer schedules, and chemical routines and enter one of the few places on Earth that knows how to grow giants without help from a single human hand. The undisturbed forest. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever walked through an ancient forest and asked yourself, who fertilizes these trees? Nobody walks through the woods pouring bags of synthetic nitrogen across the forest floor. Nobody sprays chemical fungicides around the roots of a 300-year-old oak. And yet, year after year and century after century, forests continue growing taller, richer, stronger, and more resilient. They manufacture their own fertility from rain, sunlight, fallen leaves, and the invisible army living beneath our feet. Brush aside the dry leaves covering a healthy forest floor, and you'll discover something remarkable. Underneath is often a layer of soil that is nearly black, incredibly light, moist, and porous. It carries that deep, sweet, unmistakable fragrance of healthy earth. Look even closer, and you may notice delicate white threads moving through the decomposing leaves, like some kind of underground nervous system. Those fine threads are fungal hyphae, part of an enormous cooperative network of life beneath the forest. For generations, traditional agricultural cultures around the world have understood how valuable this living soil can be. They learned to collect the organisms already thriving in healthy environments and bring that biology back into their fields. More than 60 years ago in Korea, a farmer named Cho Han-kyu looked at the forest floor and asked an incredibly simple question. If the forest can fertilize itself for free, why can't our farms do the same thing? His work helped form what became known as Korean natural farming. Cho understood that healthy soil is not merely an inactive mixture of minerals, clay, and sand. It is alive. It breathes. It functions as a thriving biological ecosystem. The microorganisms living in healthy soil act like tiny chemists. They break apart difficult organic materials, help dissolve solid minerals, and produce growth-promoting substances directly around plant roots. So the secret to building a thriving garden isn't necessarily about constantly purchasing another synthetic product to feed the plant from the outside. It is about collecting the biology that already exists in healthy soil, waking it up, multiplying it, and allowing it to continue doing what nature has done for ages. And here is the wonderful part. You don't need a PhD. You don't need sophisticated laboratory equipment. You don't need $1 million facility. You need a plastic bucket. Section 3. The 5-minute bucket. Bioreactor. All right, my friends. Now it's time to get our hands dirty. I'm going to show you the simple setup that Cho Han-kyu's son, Cho Yong-sung, developed into what is known as JMS, Jadam Microbial Solution. Think of it as a simple biological engine you can build at home. Here is what you'll need. First, a clean 5-gallon plastic bucket. Keep it simple, but avoid using metal, stainless steel, or iron containers. Acids created during fermentation can react with metal, potentially interfering with microbial reproduction while also corroding the container. Next, you'll need about 4 gallons of clean, unchlorinated water. This part matters. Water straight from many municipal taps contains chlorine or chloramine because those compounds are used to control bacteria. If that water goes directly into your microbial culture, it can interfere with the very organisms we are trying to multiply. Rainwater is an excellent option when available because it also contains naturally occurring trace elements. If tap water is your only choice, fill the bucket and leave the water exposed for 24 to 48 hours so the chlorine can dissipate. Next comes about 1 pound of ordinary potatoes. That usually means 2 or 3 medium potatoes. Wash away the soil, but don't peel them. The skin itself can carry useful microorganisms. Boil the potatoes in roughly half a gallon of water for 20 to 30 minutes until they become soft enough to crush easily with a fork. And don't discard that cloudy boiling water. Keep both the potatoes and the starchy water. If potatoes aren't available, about half a pound of leftover cooked rice boiled until very soft can also be used. Next, you'll need 2 tablespoons of unrefined sea salt. Avoid iodized table salt and seasoning powders. Iodine is strongly antiseptic and can interfere with the microbial culture we're trying to build. Use inexpensive, coarse, unrefined sea salt, the same basic kind traditionally used for pickling. It contains a wide variety of trace minerals that support microbial cells. Finally, we need 1 or 2 cups of healthy forest soil. This becomes our starter culture. Find the healthiest, oldest tree in your yard or visit a nearby forest. Gently brush aside the dry surface leaves, dig about 2 to 4 inches down, and collect a cup of that dark, light, crumbly soil. That small handful becomes the biological foundation of the entire batch. If you live high above the ground in a city and have no access to forest soil, high-quality organic compost or pure worm castings can be used instead. Now comes the 5-minute assembly. Take 2 clean ankle-high cloth socks or 2 mesh filter bags. Place your boiled potatoes inside the first one. With your hands, mash them through the fabric until they become a soft paste. Put the forest soil into the second sock. Now dissolve your 2 tablespoons of sea salt into the bucket of unchlorinated water. Submerge both bags. Use your hands to squeeze and knead the potato bag beneath the water. Almost immediately, you'll see a thick cloud of starch spreading through the bucket. Then gently knead the soil bag. Tiny particles of humus and countless microscopic organisms will begin drifting out into the water like dark clouds. Leave both bags hanging inside the bucket, suspended beneath the surface. Finally, place the lid loosely on top. Do not seal the bucket tightly. The microorganisms will generate gases during fermentation, and those gases need somewhere to escape. A tightly sealed container can build pressure. Leave the lid slightly open, enough to release gas while still helping keep insects out. Move the bucket somewhere cool and shaded, away from direct sunlight. And that's it. About 5 minutes of hands-on work, and your biological factory is officially open. Section 4. The 48-hour biological explosion. The moment you walk away from that bucket, an invisible biological explosion begins. During the first 24 hours, that starchy water becomes a feeding ground. Early colonizers, especially aerobic bacteria such as members of the hardy Bacillus genus, begin waking from dormancy. They encounter the complex potato starches and start feeding. Then they reproduce. Again and again, one cell divides into 2, and the population begins increasing at a speed that can be difficult to imagine. In microbiology, this kind of growth is often described through doubling time. Under favorable summer temperatures of roughly 60 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, some of these beneficial local bacteria can divide incredibly quickly, sometimes within 20 to 40 minutes. Think about what that means. A single bacterium dividing every 30 minutes can become more than 16 million bacteria in only 12 hours. So by the time your bucket approaches the 48-hour point, the microorganisms haven't doubled just once. They may have multiplied through many generations. It becomes a biological chain reaction. As you approach that point, lift the lid and look at the surface. You may find something remarkable waiting for you. A thick layer of creamy white foam can spread across the water, almost like the head on a freshly poured glass of draft beer. Large bubbles slowly rise and burst. A sweet and sour fermented smell comes from the bucket. So what exactly has been happening? The starch is being broken into simpler compounds. Microbial activity produces organic acids, and those acids help release minerals from the sea salt into forms circulating throughout the liquid. As fermentation continues toward the 72-hour point, oxygen inside the bucket becomes increasingly depleted, and the microbial balance begins changing. Groups such as lactic acid bacteria and yeasts become more active and begin dominating the later stages of fermentation. When that beautiful beer-like foam reaches its peak, congratulations. The microbial population inside the bucket has reached an extraordinary density. What you now have is a living liquid filled with billions of active helper organisms. They are hungry, they are multiplying, and they are ready to go to work in your garden. Section 5. Plant steroids and the colliding histories. This is where the story takes an extraordinary turn, because 2 completely different worlds begin to collide. On one side, we have an old farmer working with natural microorganisms in rural Korea. On the other, we have government scientists working inside an advanced American laboratory. Back in 1941, researchers Mitchell and Whitehead were studying corn pollen inside a United States Department of Agriculture laboratory in Maryland. They noticed something unusual. When crude extracts from that pollen were applied to other plants, dramatic growth followed. Cells divided faster. Stems elongated, and the response couldn't be fully explained by the plant hormones scientists already understood. The mystery remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. Then, in 1970, Mitchell returned to the question. His team collected more than 500 pounds of bee-gathered rapeseed pollen. After years of careful laboratory purification, all of that material eventually produced only about 4 milligrams of a pure crystalline compound. When researchers examined that tiny crystal using X-ray crystallography, they discovered something astonishing. The molecule was a steroid. A genuine steroid molecule, structurally similar in important ways to steroid hormones found in humans and animals. They named it brasinolide. The discovery opened the door to what became recognized as another major class of plant hormones, brasinosteroids. These compounds play powerful regulatory roles in plant life. They influence whether seeds germinate, how rapidly cells expand, how effectively plants carry out photosynthesis, and how plants respond to severe stresses such as cold, drought, and pest pressure. And they can work at incredibly tiny concentrations. Now let's cross the ocean and return to South Korea, where Cho Han-kyu was cultivating forest microorganisms in simple containers. Cho did not have expensive X-ray equipment. He did not have sophisticated extraction systems. What he had was observation. He watched crops respond after applications of his forest-based microbial preparations. He saw stronger growth, greater resilience, and plants loaded with fruit. Decades later, molecular biology began explaining some of the processes that farmers like Cho had already been observing in the field. Research into plant-associated bacteria showed that many familiar microbial groups, including Bacillus, Pseudomonas, Azospirillum, and Serratia, are far more than simple decomposers. They can function like miniature biochemical factories. As part of their natural metabolism, these microorganisms can produce and release compounds such as indole-3 acetic acid, an important auxin involved in root development, cytokinins associated with cell division, gibberellins linked with plant growth, and compounds displaying brasinosteroid-like activity. The kinds of plant growth regulators scientists spent decades studying and isolating inside sophisticated laboratories could also be connected to microscopic organisms living naturally in soil and multiplying inside something as simple as a plastic bucket. Isn't that beautiful? The forest floor had been carrying part of the answer all along. Section 6. Dilution, Application, and the Infinity Loop. Before you rush outside and pour this bubbling white liquid directly over your plants, stop for a moment. We need to talk about application. This microbial solution is highly concentrated and contains organic acids, so we need to respect the strength of what we have created. Pouring concentrated Jadam Microbial Solution directly over tender plants can expose young roots and leaves to an intense microbial and acidic solution. That is why the golden rule of JMS is simple: dilution. For a normal garden application, use approximately a 1:10 ratio. That means 1 cup of concentrated JMS mixed with 10 cups of clean, unchlorinated water. Or, if you're working in liters, 1 liter of JMS mixed with 10 liters of water. For delicate seedlings or more sensitive indoor plants, dilute it further, around 120 or even 130. Fill your watering can with the diluted mixture and apply it deeply around the base of the plants. Don't simply sprinkle a little across the surface. Soak the surrounding soil. The goal is to carry that army of microorganisms down into the soil profile, around the root zone, where they can begin interacting with organic matter and helping create a porous, biologically active environment. For a garden that is struggling or recovering, apply it around once a week. For a healthy and stable garden, once every 2 or 3 weeks can be enough. But now we reach my favorite part of the entire system, something I call the infinity loop. Once you have successfully brewed your first microbial batch, you no longer need to return to the forest every time you want to make another bucket. You've already captured the wild culture. When your bucket is almost empty, leave roughly half a cup, around 100 to 200 milliliters, of the active liquid at the bottom. That small amount contains an enormous population of adapted local microorganisms. Now pour that starter culture into a fresh bucket, containing about 15 liters of clean, unchlorinated water. Boil another pound of potatoes, mash them, add another spoonful of sea salt, but this time, completely skip the forest soil. You already have the microbes, and because the organisms from the first batch are awake, active, and ready to feed, they immediately begin consuming the fresh potato starch. Within roughly 48 hours, they can multiply exponentially again, producing another large bucket of microbial solution. Then the process can be repeated. From one original handful of living soil collected at the beginning of spring, you can theoretically produce 10 buckets, 100 buckets, even thousands. Whether you're feeding a few containers on a balcony or working across a multi-hectare farm, the same biological principle remains. A handful of soil, a bucket, water, potatoes, and multiplication. That, my friends, is what abundance looks like. Section 7. The workers and the bricks. Now I want to be completely honest with you. Earthly Delights has always been about practical knowledge, not hype or fairy tales. This microbial solution may be a biological wonder, but it is not a magic potion capable of replacing the physical laws of nature. I've seen claims suggesting that you can spray microbial liquid onto bone-dry, hard, degraded clay soil, sitting beneath a blazing rooftop sun, and suddenly watch plants explode with fruit. That is an illusion. The easiest way to understand the limitation is to imagine your soil as a construction site. Microorganisms are some of the hardest working construction workers on the planet. They are ready to build a fertile, living home around your plant roots. But even the greatest construction crew cannot build a house without bricks and mortar. Inside the soil, those bricks and mortar are organic matter. If your soil contains almost no organic carbon, no compost, no leaf mold, no aged manure, no straw, no decomposing kitchen scraps, the microorganisms you introduce have very little to feed on. Without food, they eventually starve and die. The real transformation happens when you combine the workers with the materials they need. That means your garden still needs a foundation of organic matter. Add compost. Feed the soil with worm castings. Cover the beds with a generous layer of organic mulch. Then, when your diluted Jadam Microbial Solution moves into that biologically rich environment, the process becomes far more powerful. The microorganisms begin working through organic residues, releasing nutrients that had been locked away and producing compounds that stimulate plant roots. There are also a few practical rules to remember. Temperature matters. Fermentation is highly sensitive to temperature. Below about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, microbial activity slows dramatically, and many organisms become relatively dormant. In a cold climate, a batch that develops quickly in summer may require 4 or 5 days instead of 48 hours. If the active culture freezes, the living population can die. There is also an important issue of storage. This is a raw, living culture. It is not designed to sit forever on a shelf. Once the bucket develops that thick, beer-like foam cap, use the solution within roughly 1 to 2 weeks. If it remains untouched for too long, the microorganisms eventually consume the available potato food. Oxygen becomes exhausted, the biological balance shifts, and the bucket can move away from useful fermentation toward putrefaction. At that point, the liquid may develop a strong rotting odor. If it smells like decay, don't use it on your plants. Pour it onto the compost pile, wash the bucket, and begin again. Section 8. The Rebellion of Simplicity. So now we arrive at the question sitting right in the middle of the room. If this process is so simple, if the biology behind microbial plant growth is well established, and if a batch can cost less than $2 to prepare, why are gardeners still purchasing bottle after bottle of fertilizer? Why is the global biofertilizer industry already worth billions of dollars and continuing to grow? The answer comes down to a combination of standardization, the illusion of complexity, and a cultural blind spot. A wild microbial community reproducing inside a plastic bucket is difficult to turn into the kind of standardized product large chemical and biotechnology companies are designed to sell. When a process can be repeated at home with water, soil, salt, and a mashed potato, there is very little opportunity to control the process through patents or complex supply chains. Industrial systems depend on products that can be packaged, transported, branded, standardized, and sold repeatedly. So microbial biology gets isolated, freeze-dried, concentrated, and standardized into products containing specific strains, such as Bacillus amyloleukfaciens, at carefully measured concentrations. And over time, gardeners can begin believing that the standardized biology inside the package must somehow be superior to the diversity already living around them. But in ecology, diversity is resilience. A commercial microbial product might contain 1 or 2 laboratory-grown strains. A simple Jadam culture may contain an enormous diversity of microorganisms already adapted to the local environment and already accustomed to surviving together in that particular soil. There is another reason these practices have remained unfamiliar to many Western gardeners. Language and culture created a massive barrier. For decades, techniques developed across Korea, Japan, India, the Philippines, and other parts of Asia remained largely unavailable to English-speaking audiences. While gardeners in English-speaking countries were paying premium prices for bottled biological products, farmers in places such as Korea had already been cultivating microorganisms in simple buckets for generations. Cho Han-kyu spent much of his life traveling across more than 30 countries, showing farmers how to make many of their own agricultural inputs. He didn't build the system around royalties. He didn't lock the recipes behind patents. He and his son shared these ideas with farmers around the world. And when you begin brewing a microbial solution in your own backyard, something surprisingly meaningful happens. You join a quiet rebellion of simplicity. You step away from the belief that everything your garden needs must come from a store. You prove that healthy food doesn't always require corporate permission, specialized acreage, or shelves filled with expensive chemical products. Sometimes the starting point is much simpler: a bucket, some water, a potato, and the soil beneath your feet. The co-creation of plenty. My friends, every time we choose to work with nature, instead of constantly trying to control or chemically force her, something changes inside us. We begin seeing our gardens differently. They stop looking like battlefields where every pest, disease, or deficiency must be attacked with another chemical weapon. Instead, they begin feeling like cooperative sanctuaries. We start realizing that we are not the absolute masters of the land. We are participants in an ancient, brilliant dance of life. So I want you to try this for yourself. Walk into your garden this week. Find a healthy tree. Brush aside the leaves and collect a handful of that rich, dark soil. Boil a couple of potatoes. Fill your bucket. Start your own biological bioreactor. Then watch. Watch the foam begin to rise. Smell that sweet fermented earth. Dilute the solution. Carry it into your garden, and let those living microorganisms meet the soil around your plants. Then observe what happens. I also want to ask you something. How much money have you spent over the years on synthetic fertilizers and chemical sprays that eventually left you needing yet another product? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely love reading your stories because every experience shared there helps this entire community learn and grow together. And if this video changed the way you think about the soil beneath your feet, if it awakened even a small desire for greater biological independence, subscribe to Earthly Delights and give this video a like. Here, we're going to keep exploring the biology, history, and natural processes hiding behind the glossy packaging we've been taught to depend on. Together, we can plant something more sustainable, something more self-sufficient, something greener. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil, keep your heart open, and remember, the earth already knows how to feed itself. And now, so do you. Goodbye, my friends. I'll see you in the next deep dive.